Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Contract Administration Practice Session. With that, I do want to hand it over to Jim Raines to get started with today's topic. So, Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew, and welcome everyone to our continuation of an introduction series into construction contract administration. We are following along with the practice guide, and we are at Chapter 5, which covers submittals. So without further ado, let's just jump right in, and please, everyone, remember, raise your hand, interrupt, be sure to let Matthew know that you have something you want to ask or to talk about, a specific point to follow up on. These are always better with your participation. So let's go to the next slide and talk about what the heck are submittals and what specifically are they not, because that can be just as important to know. So what submittals are a component of the project that offers detailed information about components of the building. They can be product data, drawings, samples, any kind of informational detail that needs to be transferred from the producer or the provider through the architect in a quality assurance process. They also can indicate how the work is intended to be fulfilled by the contractor, and they can give the owner some information in the process about the products and equipment that are going to be a part of the project. What's important to remember that they are not contract documents, and this is often confused. And they also are not items that can be used to modify the contract by any party. And this is also something that can frequently occur. So let's take a look at the next slide. These are some examples of what might be submittal information, whether they are charts of detailed information about weights and gauges and heights. They can be samples to choose from, or blown up details about how a product is assembled either by the manufacturer or maybe in the field. They can share technical information about products that are going to be used in particular details, or be something that could be used to just select patterns and finishes. So they cover a pretty wide gambit. Let's go to the next slide and talk about what these products are, what submittals information is covered, and we're going to start with the contract documents. Typically in Division 1, this is where the administrative and procedural part of submittals is covered, either within AIA documents, EJ/CDC documents, etc. So they can be discussed in the general requirements, but often designers will include a supplementary general conditions section in the specifications to drill down into more detail about submittals, and we'll talk about some of those details. But this is where the engineer or architect would spell out, using their best professional judgment, how these products will be installed within the project itself, and where and what kind of appropriate action the contractor may consider that will be returned on those submittals. So let's take a quick look at the next slide in a diagram of how these submittals will move. And I won't spend a lot of time with this, but basically from the producer of a particular product through the contractor's hands first, project managers and superintendents, to the architect, whether that firm has project architects, managing architects, perhaps through the superintendent on the project to make comments about specific field measurements, installation techniques, and then to the installer to use in actually performing that work. So these submittals may come to us as engineers or architects and be returned to the contractor and then back out into the field to be used for the installer. So this is a rough diagram of the path that those submittals will follow. And if we look at the next slide, this is a typical kind of schedule that those submittals may follow. And I want to stop here and talk about this for a second and then see if we have any questions, because the schedule becomes a very critical and important part of many projects, sometimes for not very good reasons, either on the contractor side or the architect and engineer side. So generally our documents, AIA, EJCDC documents, will say that submittals need to be reviewed in a timely manner in order to support whatever the construction activity is at the time on the construction schedule. And those timelines can vary. So, for example, the paint is not a critical thing to look at the beginning of the job, but steel rebar or concrete mix certainly are in particular kinds of projects. These schedules, some designers include in their specifications, some do not. Sometimes they include what is to be submitted with a date of when it's to be submitted, and also a date of when it is needed back by the contractor. And this is used to coordinate the overall construction schedule. These schedules will allow adequate time for review by each of the parties that are going to touch them, and they may also include examples of products that are to be bundled, submittals that might come in together as a grouping. So again, these are schedules sometimes that designers include themselves in their specifications, and at other times these are schedules that the designer may require the contractor to prepare and submit for their review in the project. So let me pause there for a second, Matthew, and see if there are any comments or questions at this point.
At this point, everybody is still pretty quiet.
Okay, great. Well, let's go to the next slide, and we'll break down with some specificity the types of submittals that are involved with the project, and then we'll take a little look into each one of these. There are pre-construction submittals, which we'll look at in a little more detail. There are construction phase submittals that are basically in two categories, one action submittals and the other informational submittals. And then finally, there is a phase for closeout and maintenance type submittals. So let's go to the next slide and look at the pre-construction submittals. First of all, when we talked about pre-construction, which was chapter 3 of the practice guide, we covered in a little greater detail what types of pre-construction submittals exist. But we'll touch on those just a minute here, sort of as a refresher. These can be certificates of insurance specific to the project, depending on the delivery type. They may be payment and performance bonds. They could be subcontractor lists or product lists where your specifications may have required those be submitted as a proposed project team. They can be preliminary, such as a construction schedule as a rough layout. Some projects require submittals of the construction schedule and perhaps a schedule of values for the job early in the process before any pay applications are processed. The submittal schedule we just talked about a little bit. There may be a logistics submittal for how the site is going to be used, particularly if it's in connection with an existing facility, if the owner is going to remain in operation. And sustainable project action plans with projects that might, in the end, receive some sort of a certification. Maybe just a few examples of what may be considered pre-construction submittals that you would look at and take action on. Let's go to then the construction submittals on the next slide. Again, we broke those into a couple of categories: action type, informational type, closeout types, and then maintenance types of submittals. So we'll look at each of these in some detail, sort of item by item. But as you can see there on the screen, this is in general the categories that we'll talk about. And Matthew, we can go right to the next slide and look at action submittals, unless there are any questions. So within action submittals, these can be things like product data, for example, illustrations of how components of the building are going to be put together, perhaps how they're going to perform, instructions about what the physical appearance ought to be once it's pulled together, and specificity with size and characteristics of materials. And it should be, these should come in marked appropriately with sufficient detail that may vary widely. So in this example, where there's a particular type clean room, the specifications would be much more extensive than some other kind of a product that you may be looking at if this were a prepackaged clean room with great detail. And so these are some of the submittals that, of course, the designer would take action on and would want to be sure were thoroughly looked at as an important part of having this product be delivered and installed on the project. And so that would be an idea of what kind of product data you may see. Let's take a look at the next slide, and these might be examples of drawings that you would see, shop drawings that are more diagrammatic and that are in sufficient detail to illustrate very clearly, particularly some portions of the work. So these may be fabrication details that are created by the manufacturer or the provider, done in specific comparison to project conditions and how the project ultimately will lay out in the end, being checked particularly with existing renovations, additions to project dimensions. These would have perhaps comments of particular components of the site. So these drawings will be very specific to the job, and it's important that they not be just reproductions of your contract documents, the plans that you have created. They can show installation instructions and sequencing, but they should be independently produced by the fabricator or manufacturer of the product in specific relationship to what they are going to do. And that would be an example, this detail of some steel connection as an example of a drawing diagram that you may see that would be an action submittal. Let's take a look at the next slide. And in addition to these two types of action submittals might be samples, where you would be selecting with the owner's input some particular colors or textures, things related to appearances, and they can be finished appearances or they can be finishes that may be hidden. You may see physical examples of what those materials are going to be, or there may just be copies of products that indicate colors. This can be a time-consuming part of the process, particularly if there are custom colors which you have specified. Then those examples need to be there. You know, in my area, there's a current hardware big box store that guarantees this paint, and it has an individual looking at paint colors, and who knew there were so many blues in the world. But that is the way it is. And so these would be very particular samples to your specific custom colors. There are variations between manufacturers, and so often these samples are used to obtain owner approval, which can take a lot of time, again, and needs to be, in reflecting back to the submittal schedule, a component that you measure into what's going to be required for your review time. So they would need to be particular to the manufacturer and be coordinated between various products. I have had the experience where we gathered all things that needed a color, and of course this is where you need to be very specific in your general conditions, your supplementary general conditions, and establishing, and we're going to touch on this a little later, the bundling of various products to make final decisions, and we'll come to that later in a little more detail. So that's a quick review of action submittals. And Matthew, we can go to the next slide and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, there's a question that came in here from Robert. He's saying, confirm that informational submittals do not require the AE's responsive action. If no response is required, why do we even request them?
Well, I think it's a great question. So let's look at this, and maybe we'll give you some answer to that as we look at what they may be. So this is a listing of information that is within the title Informational, coordination drawings, and we'll touch on these each specifically, but so I won't read that list, but so you can see within the AIA documents, this is a copy out of the A201. They are submittals which we are not expected to be responsive to, and so it's identified that way in the construction documents, but it is information that may be critical to coordination on the job and verification that certain criteria are being met. So these would be, I would say, pieces of information that we want to be sure everyone understands, and we see it transfer from party to party, so we are sure that they are informed, but we don't have to take a specific action on it because it's related to the quality requirements and it's related to the performance of the work to be in accordance with the contract documents. So let's look at the first one, and maybe I'll answer that question over this series of slides. So if you look at the next one, Matthew, so coordination drawings, why would we want to see those? Well, we want to see that there's an assignment of who's on first, and whether the sequence has been thought through by the general contractor to avoid conflict, so that the pieces of the project that need to be installed before others has been thought through. Now, building modeling has taken a huge leap forward depending on the type delivery you have with the construction project in helping to avoid problems and have coordination issues thought out. And this is something that you want to see distributed to everyone. Now, having said that, I can tell you that on many jobs that I have been associated with, the coordination drawings were done almost as a as-built record or as constructed record as the work went along, and they were not at all the coordination drawings that we were hoping to see. Folks were coordinating as they went, and I think that has hurt the projects where that was allowed to happen. Things weren't thought out in advance of having conflicts in the field. So that's a type where we want to see the assigned parties from the constructor side communicating and coordinating prior to installing the work. And then with certificates, we want to be sure that the people that are doing the work are qualified to do the work. So we want to see that they are, in fact, certified, that they have passed some performance kind of test, and that the people that are on the job are, in fact, who we want to be putting the structure together. Let's look at the next slide. And again, informational submittals. We may choose, see this happen often with trusses on a project, where we assign or delegate the design to licensed engineers. Truss types vary. The particular data of how they are, how they're designed, what the connections look like, can be very specific to a manufacturer. If you're doing design, bid, build type work, you have to accept equals, and they can be equal yet have a varying structure. So we assign that, we delegate that design to the manufacturer, and we want to be sure that they have done that. So we want some information in the file saying, well, licensed engineer has looked at this and signed off on the design, and it meets the criteria that we specified. And oftentimes the authorities having jurisdiction will want to have this documentation within the records of the project in case anything happened. Then they've got those engineers' information that actually engineered the products. And then testing and evaluation reports, we want to see the same sort of recorded documentation that independent parties have been there and looked and verify that, yes, in fact, as related to the products, they're in compliance. It's been used in the way that it's supposed to be used. We're not going to take any action on that. We're being sure that the contractor has a watchful set of eyes besides ours over her shoulder to be sure that the products are being used in compliance with how they were tested. So that's another kind of informational submittal. Let's look at the next page, and I think that, no, there's two more. Let's take a look at the next slide. And I don't want to not stop, Matthew, for a question, but maybe if I get through the informational submittals, they're just this slide and one more, and then we can go back and see if I address that question. So another informational submittal that we would not take action on would be how the manufacturer actually requires this to be installed, whether their instructions are being followed, and any kind of reports that might verify compliance of that. So you know, sometimes that subcontractors are licensed to do a particular installation by a particular manufacturer. We want to be sure that they are properly authorized, and we want to see that documented so that we can have that for our owner's protection and potential follow-up. We want to be sure that they're complying with it. Sometimes these are done in the field as a follow-up inspection. Sometimes they're done during the sequence of construction. But those would be something that would come in during the life of the project. Also, sustainable design reports, how the contractor is tracking the materials, you know, as part of recycled content. Also that the contractor has on site materials that meet our VOC content requirements for the project. These are separate submittals that can be critical to receiving some sort of certification or rating for the building, and so these are used to document that sort of information during and then particularly at the end of a project. And then one more slide, the last one for informational. Let's go to the next one, Matthew, and this would include qualification statements for fabricators, erectors. These would be, again, very similar to the licensing of an installer, but would list levels of expertise and experience. It's important to keep an eye on these because they can expire or require some sort of renewal by a particular subcontractor on a project. So you will want to, when you get these, put that calendar reminder. Same thing with performance and payment bonds on a project, or particularly insurance coverage on a project. There are things that require renewal, particularly if a job lasts over a calendar year. So that's something that you want to stay aware of and follow up on. And then the last thing under informational submittals may be construction photos. We may require in our specifications that there's some record that the contractor keep being there every day. These can be critical to dispute resolution, but that's a visual record that we may assign responsibility to the constructor to keep. So that's a quick pass through informational submittals, and I'll stop and see if there are any new questions, and if I answered a bit of the original question about why would we, if we're not going to take action on them, why would we ask for these? So Matthew, any follow-up questions?
Yeah, 2 questions came in so far. One, aren't the construction photos done as part of the observation reports and punch list? If you could clarify one more time when the photos are part of a submittal. I'll start with that question.
Okay. Yes, we typically do take construction photos with our observation reports and document what we're seeing, and it helps to create a record of when we were there. So yes, they would very definitely be a part of what we do in our performance of our duties, but they also can be something that we require the contractor to do as a record of what is occurring, because they are there much more frequently. And so in fact, some projects even go so far as to have cameras set up that take time-lapsed photos of particular areas of construction. So they can be an informational type submittal on some projects depending on the constructor. So I would say yes to both. We do take them, and they are a part of our reports, but these would be construction photos in addition to that.
All right, and the next question came in from Peter here is, do we increase our liability when we approve, in quotes, informational subs?
Well, I think that the intent of an informational submittal, first of all, should be very well described in your general conditions or your supplementary general conditions, to say this is a informational submittal only, that we are not taking an action on it, but they are being shared with us for information purposes only. So let's use the coordination drawings, for example. We are not looking at these. We're not putting a stamp on them and sending them back. Our involvement in a set of coordination drawings is we require it, and that's it. The rest of it is the responsibility is on the group of constructors. We know it's important to do because all work needs to be coordinated. So I think if you took these submittals in and you did look at them and take action on them and put your stamp on them, then I believe anything that we end up putting our submittal stamp on can begin to involve us in the liability part of a project. And we're going to talk about those stamps a little later here, but these are something that I would suggest for your consideration that you don't stamp and return.
All right, we have a few more questions that have kind of popped in here. One from Bobby asking,
Okay.
where in the CDs does it state informational submittal specifically? Is it in specs or somewhere else?
Yes, yes, I would include it in the specifications. Actually, if you go to the practice guide in Chapter 5 and take a look at that, I would absolutely break down my general conditions into supplementary general conditions and include these descriptions of the submittals that we are going to take action on and the submittals that we want to see as informational.
All right. Next question comes in from Chris. Would it be reasonable to stamp some informational submittals with that for record purposes only, or similar stamp language to communicate clearly back to the field?
Well, yes, you could do that. You know, we'll get to a slide here that has some examples of stamps, and maybe we could come back and answer that in more detail when we get there. Would that be okay?
Sure. And then we also have one last one coming in from Robert saying info submittal, say receipt acknowledged, no stamp unless the info is incorrect. So I think that's his take on some of the conversation we talked about with stamping and opening up liability. But those are the questions we have at this point, so I will move to the next slide for you.
Okay. And we'll get a chance to talk about another action, which is we take no action as we go further here in the slides. And so the next category we're going to talk about would be the closeout and maintenance phase submittals, so that the owner will be provided their operations and maintenance manuals, if there are particular bonds or particularly warranties for various components of the project, whether it's products, roof, or equipment. There would also be record documents that would include all of the shop drawings that have come in, any kind of drawings, record drawings, any addenda changes that happened within the project, and these construction photos. So they may be important for an owner to use to relocate hidden items in the future for future additions or renovations. This closeout process would include particular tools that are needed to maintain the project, as well as the key and keying information. Typically, those are delivered straight to the owner with product data or any of the submittal about keys or centered around the keys. And anything else that is a closeout document itself. It might be a copy of the final certificate of occupancy and those type of documents that are used to conclude the project and make final payment. These are more related to the owner's operation of the facility. They may be in these binders that remain at the job for facilities maintenance personnel or operations people, facility management people to use at the site. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit and let's go to the next slide and talk about when we do receive action submittals, what kind of actions are involved in the submittal itself, and what's the sequence for the life of a submittal. So let's go to the next slide, Matthew, and talk about preparation. So the submittal is going to come from a fabricator, a subcontractor, a supplier, and go through the contractor, the general contractor. Typically, the description of management of that submittal and preparation of it is in Division 1 of the general conditions. But within each division of a product, there's more explicit information about the preparation of the submittals themselves per product. So that gives the detail of what it is you expect to receive from the contractor. numbers required, where they go, that sort of thing. And this may include information from the contractor. It may include information from the project representatives, and that comes through the general contractor to you to be looked at and processed. So let's take a look at what kind of actions in once it has been prepared. And let's look at the next slide and talk about how it's reviewed. So we've looked at tracking. We've talked a little bit about schedule and who produces it and processes it to us. The contractor should always receive this prepared submittal first and take action on it. So the contractor reviews the documents for compliance and then stamps that package before you receive it. Our action would be that as the architect or engineer, we would decide, is it consistent with our design intent? But that's as far as we go. Is this consistent with our design intent? And that is what our review is about. We are not determining accuracy of quantities. We're not determining dimensions. That is a part of the process that the contractor is responsible for. And I will share with you a comment that I add at the bottom, just from past experience, that the owner should always have their opportunity for input in a submittal. Now, the book doesn't describe it that way. The practice guide doesn't necessarily describe it that way, but I frequently have owners who say, you just keep those submittals and turn them all over to us at once when you're done. Well, I don't do that. I send them the submittals. If they involve a product or color selection, I'll send them to them as I review them. I then follow that up with a submittal to them once the review is complete and I've sent it back to the constructor. I think it's important, particularly when owners have facilities and maintenance personnel. I have received extremely valuable input from the owner's team when I involve them in the review or in the action that is taken on submittals. We could spend a whole webinar talking about owners' input into areas that I guess maybe those in the risk management business would say you really shouldn't do. But I find more communication with the owner, more input that you can have from them into those products, the better and happier they are when they move in. So what are the actions that we may take while we're reviewing? And these are words that, again, risk management people have argued about for years. And we're going to take a look at some of these stamps that change this wording. But in essence, we are either approving a submittal and the work can proceed as it's been submitted, or we're approving it as noted. So there may be some modifications that are needed and we're able to note those. They're pretty minor. We may say, there are a lot of things here that need to be changed. You need to revise this and resubmit it. We can take the action to reject it outright and say, try again. This is non-conforming. We may say, no action taken or required. So for the previous example, that might be something that you do with an informational submittal. So that the contractor knows you did see it, you do have it, and that requirement has been met. So you have it and there's no action taken. Or you may stamp something that says this is not required for review. And we'll talk about that in more detail here in a second. Let's go to the next slide and talk about what might be an incomplete submittal that we're unable to take any action on whatsoever. So what if you receive a submittal that is incomplete? Well, then you do take on unnecessary risk in doing anything with that submittal, in processing it. Perhaps the general contractor didn't look at it. Perhaps there are only certain pieces of it that are in the package, but there are more pieces that are necessary. This can create delays in the project. It certainly causes a delay in your review, and it can impact how things turn around on the job, delivery of materials, etc. It's really important that when you receive a submittal, you open that package, look at it, even if it's a two-phase review where you look at the submittal and decide this is incomplete, stamp it as such, say not reviewed. And if you can send it back the day you got it or the day after, that is critical to the timeline on the project and might be very advantageous to you and to the contractor. So a package can be incomplete, is sent back to be completed and processed properly. On the other hand, there may be packages that come to you as a partial package. And unlike something that's incomplete, this may have been done on purpose. For example, with HVAC systems, the contractor may be able to get the ductwork reviewed and in fabrication, which can take some time, get the air handlers reviewed and in production, which can take some time, and have more time to get the HVAC controls worked out into a submittal and sent to you. Now, this should be something that's decided early in the project. In the creation of the specifications, you may even say in supplementary general conditions, here are some systems that we would consider accepting partial submittals on. For example, rebar can be turned around, especially on a fast track project, so that you get that back in their hands. This procedure, this process has got to be clearly defined. The package needs to be noted as partial and processed as such. And the final requirement to assign the coordination of parts to the general contractor is something I personally believe is important. And again, this is something that can go in your supplementary general conditions to say, we'll do this to help the project, we'll do this to help the schedule, but understand we're assigning you specifically the coordination of these parts once the partials are finished. And we accept no responsibility or risk related to that partiality, if you will. Matthew, if we don't have any questions, let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, we had one that was in another one just popped up actually from Bobby. If I have a submittal that is reviewed and stamped by our consultant, say structural as an example, what is my responsibility as the architect to stamp the action submittal?
Well, that's a great question. And my experience has been that we are the contracting party with the owner. So it's our responsibility. The structural engineer is a consultant of ours. So we are ultimately responsible for the entire project. Typically, we're the ones that sign the certificate certifying that it's built in accordance with the plans and specifications. So we take on a part of the responsibility there, whether we want to or not. Now, the things that are under the purview of the licensure of an engineer related to law certainly lie with the engineer. So they're responsible for their design, let's say structural, their calculations, let's say structural. And it has always aggravated me, especially structural engineering, that our stamp is on that set of documents as well. My review with structural engineering has been not about the structure itself, but about the coordination around the structure, so that dimensionality of the spaces and particularly the systems are included in that review. So let me say that a different way. Often I will send the structural engineering drawings to the HVAC engineer, and I've told them this, and they've worked with me enough to know I'm going to do this, to ask the HVAC folks to take a look at elevations, heights of steel, dimensions of materials, to be sure we're not going to have any conflicts with ductwork crossing in certain spaces. Now, do I pay for that? Yes, I do as a fee, but I think it's important to have that kind of coordination. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I miss my buddy Doug when we start talking about legalistic implications, and I wish he were here to answer that.
A few more questions that have popped in here. I'm going to go out of order. So, Chris, your question's coming up shortly. But Merceda, I believe is how you pronounce your name, is asking who's responsible for declaring that a submittal is not, or that a submittal is incomplete of sorts.
Well, I would retain that authority as the designer of record, and I would make that judgment based on what the specifications require. So within my general conditions, I would generally describe what type of submittals, what type of packages are due, but then with each component of the specifications in each product, it also lists what is required for that particular product. Let's say paint as an example. And so I would make that judgment based on the information listed within the spec section itself. And I would tell them that in my general conditions that we're going to review it, and if it's not complete based on the specifications, it would be returned. So I think you have that authority.
All right. We have, actually, while that was going on, Chris gave me some more info. So Chris's question is, when a part of the contract, doesn't the AIA 201 general conditions state that by submitting, a contractor acknowledges review of a submittal by submitting to the AE? In this instance, is it necessary to obtain a stamp? And specifically, he's referring to clause 3.12.6 of the A201.
Wow, that's really specific. So I would assume yes. I'm not looking at that, so I would say yes, it does. I think the stamp might be more a procedural thing. I want to see that they have seen it. I want them to have to initial that they have seen it. As we'll touch on if we have time here today, these stamps should be on every page. And so I want them to prove to me that they've touched it. And I think that's why it's important to ask them to stamp it. But you're right. If they send it to us, I think that is a legal implication that they have in fact reviewed it and processed it.
Okay.
I think you're right.
All right. With that, then I will move to the next slide for you, Jim.
Okay. Well, we'll probably run out of time before we get all these done, so I'll try to move expeditiously. But as we touched on earlier, there are submittals that are bundled, and these are occurrences where it's to the benefit of the project and to the project components to be looked at one time. And I try to spell this out in my supplementary general conditions. Look, we're not picking carpet until we get the wall base and the vinyl tile and the paint and the mini blinds and the door finish, because it's all together. And so we have these work packages, Mr. and Ms. Contractor, that we need to receive from you so that we can look at those together I know they involve multi subcontractors, and so it might help them. For example, in a curtain wall system that has windows and doors that are being provided by a different supplier, then they need to see this together. So we want to know that all those parties have looked at these. So we want you to bundle some of these. And sometimes it's important to have concurrent reviews. So your structural engineer may have had some wind calculations. Curtain walls may require integral structural components that aren't necessarily a part of the curtain wall system. So we've got some concurrent reviews that we need to see these products together. And I try to spell those out and say, these are opportunities for you to bundle things and get them processed expeditiously. So I want to touch also on the not required. So more and more often, because the contracts are handled the way they are, I hear the general constructor say to me, look, I received this. These people aren't going to sign my contract with them if this submittal isn't looked at. I got it in the mail, so I sent it to you. If it's not something that I list in my specifications, I do not review it. That's important. If you receive a package and it's not required by your contract documents, you are not obligated to review it. And in fact, I would stamp it, no action taken. And Doug, who presents these along with me, and other attorneys have said, and when you do that, you return every single copy and do not retain any copies in your office. If you receive a submittal, let me say that again, that's not required by your contract documents, stamp it, no action taken, and send them all back. Because you don't want a copy of something that you don't require related to that contract in your project files. So that's an action that might generate a lot of hard feelings, but it's important to do. Let's take a look at the next slide and talk about the stamps.
As we do that, I was just going to say, Marissa chimed in with related to that last question we had. If she remembers correctly, the removal of the required GC stamp was included in the updated A201. So I'm not sure of that right now, but that might be something for all of us to look at after this call as well.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Absolutely. That's kind of stuff that I love as a product of these webinars, because I thank you for pointing that out. And I'll look so the old one said the contractor shall review, approve, and submit, and we will take action on that. But it doesn't say there that they'll stamp it. EJCDC says one thing, which is almost the same, but it does say it will bear a stamp. These stamps become very much a center of discussion when something goes awry. Your professional liability carrier has great interest in them. Any legal counsel you have certainly wants to see the wording. It's interesting. I don't know how vague we could get with a stamp, but I've seen some that almost seem like they say this submittal was in our office and it did pass through, and that's about it. The stamp isn't a contract document, so it can't add to any responsibility, but it also cannot take away any responsibility. Your responsibility and liability with the project lies within the contract documents other than this stamp. That stamp is not that. So, the general conditions enforce what is required legally as far as what a submittal means, and that's where the meat of the responsibility and liability lies. And if you go, Matthew, just to the next slide and take a look at what these stamps can look like, they can say approved, they can say accepted, they can say reviewed, they can say no exception taken. Wordsmith it any way you want. the requirement of the liability, the application of responsibility on you as a designer rests within other parts of the contract. So these are all entirely acceptable stamps that say maybe different things but end up meaning the same thing. So Matthew, let's stop right here. The next slides talk about the participants' responsibilities. And we sort of kind of covered those things in general. And basically, I'll just summarize all of them by saying we are all part of the team responsible for keeping current, responsible for keeping project records, responsible for following construction schedules and allowing reasonable time to be responsive and to reply to things as necessary to keep the project on schedule. And you can look through these when Matthew posts them at the end of the webinar. And this includes the owner and the consultants and the contractor and the architect and the engineers that are associated with the job. And all of that processing, all of that review and return needs to be done in a very timely basis and very thoroughly documented back and forth. I apologize for running out of time, but I want to stop talking and see if there are other questions, and let's use our last few minutes to talk about those things without looking through the rest of the slides.
Well, we did have the one question asking for how to get the PDF of the presentation. So heads up for everybody. Hopefully, you should be able to see it on your screen within the GoToWebinar panel. There should be an option for handouts, and the PDF of today's slides has been uploaded to that area. So hopefully you all can find that to download the slides. If it's not immediately visible as a section called handouts in that GoToWebinar area, you may need to go under either the options or the view, figure out what they call it at the very top of that panel, and make sure that it's highlighted so you can view that. So hopefully you'll be able to get to that. That PDF is up there for you all to download. Additionally, Peter is asking more, I guess, a general topic about suggestions on electronic submissions. So I guess if you have any information you'd like to talk to about that.
Well, only that it is becoming the norm for sure, and certainly is much more sustainable activity. And we probably should, maybe we could do a follow-up at some point about electronic submittals, and be sure Doug is here to talk about how that may change or modify things. I would just say one last thing about these submittals is when they come to you, be timely with them. They become the center of litigation more often than any of us would like to imagine because we don't handle them in a timely basis. And they are an important tool for the contractor to stay on schedule. And while the submittals themselves may not lay a lot of responsibility on us, the return of that information is critical. So in the specifications, when it says you'll return them within 5 days, you be sure and do that, or change your specifications. And this is what has led to people including a submittal schedule in their documents, because, as I said, they don't need paint immediately. They need steel immediately. And so you can set that up in your project specifications to protect yourself as much as inform the contractor.
All right, there's another question that came in here from Ryan. He's asking, as an owner who has guide specifications and specific submittals, I want to see or I ask the AE to let me review specific information submittals like contractor qualifications. Once I verify the qualification, if I find it incomplete or invalid, what actions can I take?
Well, first, that would be disappointing if your designer had not caught that, but absolutely communicate that back to your architect or engineer of record, pointing out that there's something there that you see that is a concern, and discuss that with them, and that might lead to a meeting with that particular provider or subcontractor. And if they aren't qualified, then that could add up to them being removed from the project and one who does meet the qualifications being brought in. And, you know, that's not something to shy away from. If they truly are not qualified and don't meet the specifications, then you have the grounds there to say, you know, they can't do this work.
Okay, well, we don't have any questions at the moment. Again, reminder that we do this monthly. So this is number 5 in what looks to be probably a 10 to 12 part series. So we'll be going into early 2018 with these. We do meet once a month on the fourth, typically the fourth Thursday, or the fourth Tuesday of the month. So look forward to that when we get into September with the next section. No additional questions seem to be coming in at this point. So I guess, Jim, if there's anything else you'd like to close out with, we are a few minutes after the hour.
Sure. No, just thank you, everyone, for being here. Our next webinar is going to start to talk about site observation reports. So I hope you all come back on the 4th Tuesday of September. And I appreciate you being here, and I really appreciate the questions and the involvement. It always makes them better. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you again, Jim. We look forward to seeing all of you there. So with that, thank you again for attending. You may now disconnect from the meeting. Thanks, everybody.